lot to cover today. We're talking about two different characters in the Bible, and I want to talk to them in a certain talk about them in a certain context. So, if you would turn to Genesis chapter 14. All right, we're looking at two Old Testament characters, both who are important in their own right, and both who are referred to in, actually in other parts of the Old Testament, even after their historical reference. And then they're both referred to in the New Testament, but they're referred to in completely different ways. And this is what I want you to understand, the difference in when the New Testament authors use an Old Testament character as in an illustrative way. So as an illustration of some point. Or do they use them as a typological figure? That is, that they're somehow a foreshadowing of Christ and redemption. All right, so not every person in the Bible foreshadows Christ. Not every text directly foreshadows Christ. We can say that all of the Old Testament ultimately points to Christ. But there are parts of it that do so very explicitly. And we know this because the New Testament authors tell us that it does. Where we get in trouble is when we start seeing Jesus in some Old Testament character that the New Testament never tells us about. I'll give you, to me, sort of the most controversial example of that. So we see, like there are people in the Old Testament that we say that this is a foreshadowing of Christ, and Christ is compared to this person. David, the most obvious, right? So Jesus is the son of David. Jesus is on the throne of David. The Psalms, many of the Psalms written by David or about David, apply to Christ. So David is, in many ways, though not in every aspect, but in many ways, a type of Christ, right? We know that. The Bible tells us that. You just see David all over the New Testament, the son of David. And we're going to look at another one today, and that is the one we're about to look at here in Genesis 14, Melchizedek. Melchizedek, whom Abraham visits, or at the time his name is still Abram, and he visits Melchizedek and gives him tithes. We're told both in Psalm 110 that Melchizedek is connected to the Davidic kingship. That the Davidic king, there's coming a Davidic king who will be also a priest. Not a priest after the order of Aaron, because Aaron's of the tribe of Levi. David, of course, is of the tribe of Judah. So how can a person who's in the tribe of Judah be a priest? Well, there's a second order of priests, and it's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110 tells us that. And then in Hebrews chapter 7, the writer to the Hebrews picks up that very thing and says, aha, look here. Melchizedek is a type of Christ. He tells us that. We know that. Now, we don't have any problem pointing to Melchizedek, saying, Melchizedek's a type of Christ. The New Testament tells us that. What about a guy like Joseph? Joseph, there are certain things we see that remind us of the story of Christ. He's sold for, in his case, 20 pieces of silver, not 30 like Jesus, but he's sold for silver, betrayed by his brethren, so to speak. He's faithful, even in his servitude. He's a faithful servant, and he is in the end exalted. We go, wow, well, that's a type of Christ. Well, the New Testament never says that. So, this is a sort of a controversial thing. There are people, a lot of my Presbyterian friends, they believe that basically all Old Testament figures that are of any worth sort of prefigure Christ, and that we should find Christ, some aspect of Christ in all of those figures. But I'm not there. I say, no, we find Christ where the New Testament tells us we see Christ, and I'm not willing to go beyond that. So there are things that I'm always looking for. What is the warrant for seeing Jesus in the Old Testament? And I think we find that warrant in the New Testament. The New Testament tells us, look, there he is. Then we should see him there. But if the New Testament doesn't tell us that, I think the most we can say, for instance, like Joseph, is now, is there a motif we see in the story of Joseph that the story of Jesus certainly operates in that same motif? Yeah. But we got to be careful that we're not doing with the Old Testament simply what we could also do with the Odyssey by Homer or Aesop's Fables. We could sort of tell the story of the Odyssey, and I could show you Jesus in the Odyssey. Are there certain things about the Odysseus's struggle to get home that are like what Jesus did? Yeah, they are, because, I mean, it's a road story. The Odyssey is sort of, you got the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're sort of the basic stories of all of Western civilization. Everything's a war story with a little love story in there, or it's a road story with a love story in there. I mean, this is what Western literature is. It's all the Iliad or the Odyssey. So just because I see similar motifs doesn't mean I can say, well, the Odyssey's about Jesus. And I think we have to say that about a character like Joseph. You know, it's not that Joseph is a type of Christ. I don't believe he is. The New Testament never says that he is. Do I see similarities? Yeah, and certainly we're going to see all those Old Testament stories in the light of the story of redemption. But when the New Testament tells us this is a type of Christ, you see Jesus here, this is like Jesus, well, then we're completely on firm footing. We don't have to question that. So just a little bit of care with our language there. Let's make sure that when we say something or someone is a type of Christ, that we have a biblical warrant for that we can say, yeah, right there. There's the biblical warrant that Melchizedek is a type of Christ. We don't have biblical warrant that Joseph is a type of Christ. We see similar themes, similar motifs. We can certainly say that. And I could show you a lot of places like that in the Old Testament. Today we're going to look at two figures, Melchizedek, who is used as a type of Christ. And then we're going to look at Balaam, who's used not as a type of Christ, for one thing, because he's a bad guy, mostly. But he is used in the New Testament, not once, but 3 times, as an illustration, a warning, if you will, for Christians. So let's look at these two characters and get the story, because they're both significant and both are used, but in 2 different ways, all right? So in Genesis 14, you have the story of Abram, who goes and rescues Lot. Remember, Lot and Abram have parted ways. Lot, Abram, they had so many flocks and herds that the land couldn't sustain both of their groups of livestock. And so Abram says to Lot, you choose whichever way you want to go, and I'll go the other. Lot looks down and sees the well-watered plains of Jordan and says, that's where I'm going. And you know the story, ends up in Sodom, and things don't go so well for him there. He chooses what looks good, and it doesn't turn out well. While he's in Sodom, remember, there's no such thing as a nation at this point. There are all these cities, and each city is its own kingdom, and each city might belong to a different people group. So you have cities of the Midianites, like later you're going to have even in Israel, you're going to have cities of the Philistines. There is no one king of the Philistines. There's several kings of cities. And the same way here, you've got several cities, and they enter into an alliance together to attack a bunch of other cities. And you see in verse 8, the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now this would be pretty typical warfare. You have leagues, cities that enter into league with each other, and why are you going to war? It's all about stuff. You're raiding these cities to get their stuff, to get their food supplies, get their wealth. If you can get their land, but it's hard to get land when you're a little city yourself. You don't have an army big enough to control land. You can only control your land. But if you can go get their stuff, bring back with a few slaves, then you're doing okay. So this is typical ancient Near Eastern life. They're always going to war. They're stealing each other's stuff. They're taking each other's stores of food. And when they do this, it says here that verse 10, now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So this is probably part of the military strategy to force them into this land where you've got these basically tar pits, and you can't get an army through there. They're falling into these tar pits. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. That's what they do. They take their stuff. Let's go home. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So raiding Sodom, they're raiding these cities that they've just routed their armies. Now they go in there. Remember, there would not have been many men in the city because most of the men would have been in the army. But Lot is a foreigner who's living in Sodom, so he's still there. The army goes in after having defeated the army of Sodom, and the only men that would have been in there would be old men. They're not going to do you a whole lot of good. But Lot, a young, healthy guy, he will be a great slave. And so they grab him, and they're taking him back. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house. Now look at this number, 318 of them. What you've got, Abram here has his own moving city. Everywhere he goes. How big do you think was the population of Abram's moving city? If he's got 318 men of fighting capability, how many old men does he have? How many women? How many children? How many flocks and herds to support that many people? I mean, Abram is fabulously wealthy. I mean, he's his own little moving country. And that's really quite significant. So he takes 318 and he goes in pursuit as far as Dan. Now Dan is in the north of Israel. Some of you that have been to Israel with me, you remember up there near Caesarea Philippi, we crossed the spring there. That's the Jordan means the springs of Dan. So the Jordan River, where it starts up there in the north of Israel, then it comes down out of the foothill of Mount Hermon. It goes down into the Sea of Galilee, the Yarden, the springs of Dan. That's way up in the north, and they're down here in the south. Abram gets after them, and they go up as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. So now you're over in Syria. I just want you to get the details here. Abram is tough, and he's got a crack army. These trained guys, they can pursue all the way from down south up to the north, across into Syria. They've got to ascend the Golan Heights, go on the road to Damascus, where centuries later Saul of Tarsus will be saved. Abram goes that way. I mean, this is quite a military feat. He hunts them down. He brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. Now imagine this caravan coming back. Abram has led his army up there. He's defeated the four kings. He's got back all the booty, the spoils of war that they had taken, and the slaves. Notice the women and the people. So they had taken a lot of people captive, those that were still in the city, that weren't in the army, that they had routed, and taken them as slaves. Can you imagine what this felt like? I mean, man, you're going into slavery. You're already several hundred miles from home. You've been forced on this long march up to Damascus. And why there? Because that's the major trade route that connects Egypt down in the south, the Mediterranean coastal plain, Damascus, and then on into Arabia. You sell these slaves, you get money for them, and they're gone. They're history. There's no way they're ever getting home. Abram and his army hunts them down, liberates these people, takes them home. That did not happen in the ancient world, and it happened here. Now, Abram is the guy, right? He's leading this army. In the ancient world, he would be rightfully entitled to the spoils of war. I mean, even if he just kept half of it and gave back half, who wouldn't take that deal? We've lost everything, and here comes a liberator who's going to give us back our women and men, and he's going to keep just half the spoils of war that were taken from us. Good deal. And no one would have begrudged him that. But Abram won't keep the stuff. He says he doesn't want anybody to think that it wasn't God who gave him what he has. At verse 17, after his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, El Elyon. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. Now, incredible scene, I think, for a lot of reasons. One is just Abram's complete trust in the Lord, that I'm trusting the Lord. Notice he calls God the possessor of heaven and earth. God owns everything. I don't need to keep this. I'm already fabulously wealthy. Why? Because I'm the follower. I follow God who owns it all. So I'm not going to take this, because you'll take credit for my wealth. You'll say, look, I made Abram rich. I don't want you to think you made me rich. So he doesn't keep anything. He does, however, give a tithe to Melchizedek. Now, frankly, Melchizedek is one of the most intriguing, puzzling features in all the Old, our characters in all the Old Testament. Because, first of all, who is he? Who is he? Where does he come from? Who's his mother, his father? When's he born? When's he die? We're not told any of that. He just shows up. Where is he? Okay, he's at the valley of Shaveh, the King's Valley. We know it as the Kidron Valley. So this is in Jerusalem, what later becomes Jerusalem. He is the king of Salem, which is later going to be called Jebu-Salem, New Salem, Jerusalem. All right, so here's Abram coming back from up near Damascus. He's following that central mountain range, and he comes to Jerusalem, what we know as Jerusalem. There's a priest there. He's a king and a priest. Okay? So you're beginning to see the typology shape up here. He's the king of what? He's the king of Salem. What's Salem mean? Peace, shalom. So he's the king of peace. What's his name? Melchizedek, which means the king of righteousness. You hear the word the Hasidic Jews, same word, Tzaddik. The Hasidim, the Hasidic Jews are the righteous Jews. And so he's the, Melech is the Hebrew word for king. You always thought you went to Burger King, but you went to Burger Melech. Just remember that, Burger Melech. And so Melchizedek is God, is the king of righteousness. So he's the king of peace. He's the king of righteousness. He lives on the very spot that will later become the Davidic capital, Jerusalem. And there, Abraham acknowledges him as God's representative and pays him tithes. Well, this one little story becomes foundational. Look at the blessing of Melchizedek as all right, first of all, he brought out bread and wine. And it's a particular salt bread. And they call this the covenant of salt. By the way, salt in the ancient world is currency. It's where our word salary comes from. You say he's not worth his salt. All the stuff you learn in Sunday school, Buckrun, it's amazing, isn't it? So they make this covenant. Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek. They have this covenant of bread and wine, and he blessed him. And he listened to the blessing. And by the way, this blessing is still said by Jews to this day over meals, and when they break bread together. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And when I take a trip to Israel, we always go a particular itinerary, and when we first arrive at Jerusalem, we come up over Mount Scopus, and we stop the bus and we get off, and there we do this covenant. We eat bread, and we're Baptists, so we make it grape juice. But we have this particular blessing, and our group always sees Jerusalem for the very first time at this very place. And what an incredible blessing. Abraham gives him a tithe, a tenth of everything. And all right, no more Melchizedek. He's not in the story anymore. He doesn't show up again. How many verses does he get? Verse 18 down to verse 20. That's it. You think, minor figure, not much about him. All right, turn over to Psalm 110. So now, hundreds of years later, and here David is the king. And listen to this psalm. You hear this quoted in the New Testament. Jesus uses this very psalm to confound the Pharisees. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Now right there, that's what? The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And this is, of course, we know this. We understand this. What's going on? It's God the Father saying to God the Son. But when David writes this, it was hard to make sense of it. This is why Jesus pulls up this very psalm in his interaction with the Pharisees. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments. From the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. What? Now, think about that. Here's David, hundreds of years later, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, writing things that really you can't make sense of apart from Christ. And what warrant does David have to say that the king, the one whom God says, sit here at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, is also a priest? Now, I will just tell you that, remember a few weeks ago in Luke when we were studying Jesus eating, his disciples eating grain on the Sabbath. Why, how can you do that? And Jesus referred back to David and his men going there to the high priest, and they ate the showbread. Remember that? I believe that David was entitled to eat the showbread because he as the king, he also had a priestly function. And I think that Psalm 110 is about that. David is saying God's made him a priest, not after the order of Aaron. He's not one of the Levites. He doesn't minister in that temple. But he in type is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, nothing much more is made of that. There it is in Psalm 110, verse 4. When we get to the New Testament, however, over and over we see Jesus referred to as the Son of David, the Son of David. He's the Son of David. And so therefore, if he is indeed the Messiah, he must, and he sits on the Davidic throne, he must be the priest forever after the order of Melchizedek of Psalm 110, verse 4. And that's exactly what the writer to the Hebrews picks up. Turn over now to Hebrews chapter 5. And look at Hebrews 5, verses 6 through 11. Well, back up, verse 5. Verse 1. Actually, go back to 4:14. Here it's talking about Jesus being our high priest. In 4:14, we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Verse 1 of chapter 5, for every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men. He sort of tells what a high priest does. Verse 5, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Now that's from Psalm 2. He says also in another place, now here's the quote from Psalm 110, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So here the writer to the Hebrews takes Psalm 110 and he says, that is Jesus. This is what God says to Jesus. You are my son, Psalm 2, and you are a priest forever. So he's the son of David, son of God, and he's the priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Well, what priestly function did Jesus perform? Verse 7, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So he's saying Jesus is that high priest like Melchizedek. And in the days of his flesh, he offered up prayers and supplications on our behalf. And he accomplished our salvation because he was designated as that high priest who represents God to man and man to God after the order of Melchizedek. Turn over to chapter 6 and verse 17. Chapter 6, verse 17. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have a strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Now again, who goes into that the most holy place behind the veil? The high priest does. Where Jesus has gone, so Jesus has gone into God's presence for us as our high priest, a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He's first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, Melchizedek, King of Righteousness. And then he's also King of Salem, that is King of Peace. He's without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Okay, now this is where you get a little bit of a controversy. Some people go, okay, does this mean Melchizedek was not a human being, that he was in fact the pre-incarnate Christ? Because where does he come from? You know, we're not told mother. He doesn't have a mom or a dad. You don't see when he's born. He doesn't die. God appears to Abram down in the land of the Ur of the Chaldees and shows himself to him. But here's Melchizedek, who's called a priest of the Most High God. How does he know God? How does he know who God is? How does he have anything to do with God? I mean, we don't know. So there are some who think, well, that's what's called a theophany. That's Jesus appearing in human form, not like the incarnation, but in a temporary way. Jesus is the King of Salem, the King of Righteousness, King of Peace. He meets Abraham there, receives tithes because he is the priest. There are people who believe that. It's not without its attraction. I don't think that. I think he's a real guy whom God had somehow revealed himself to. He's a priest of God, and he's there in what later is known as Jerusalem. In fact, there is a place right now in the city of David in Jerusalem They call it the house of Melchizedek. The archaeologists are excavating it, and it is a dwelling of a sort of a wealthy personage from this time period, or from the time of the patriarchs. And archaeologists, though without any archaeological evidence that has the name Melchizedek anywhere on it, they're calling it the house of Melchizedek. They're excavating it. It would have belonged to someone who was sort of the king of that city from the time of Abraham. It very well could be Melchizedek's house. What I'm saying is, I think Melchizedek was a real person. I think we're just not told his mother and father, but I'm confident that he had one. We're not told when he was born and when he died, but I think he did. But he is in a type. God raises him up to paint a picture. And that picture is a picture of the priesthood of Jesus Christ. And in just those 2 or 3 verses in Genesis 14, you get this type that David himself sees and applies to himself as God's anointed king. But of course, then the writer to the Hebrews, he really picks up on it. He continues in verse 4. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave 1/10 of the spoils. Those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. So look what he's saying. He's saying that there's something greater about Melchizedek than about Abraham. And as Abraham had the promises, but Melchizedek blesses him. So he's saying, what he's showing here is basically that the descendants of Abraham, including the Levites, have one greater than them who blesses them, and that is Jesus, that he's not descended from Abraham no more than Melchizedek was from Abraham. So in the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there's a change in the priesthood, there's necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe from which no one has ever served at the altar. He said, Melchizedek, and he never served at the altar in the temple. His descendants never served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who's become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. On the one hand, the former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Man, and then he just continues to go on through chapter 8 about the great priesthood of Jesus Christ. You see here the Holy Spirit inspires the author of this epistle to see in both Genesis 14 and in Psalm 110 that applies to Jesus, and he just begins to work through all the implications of that. Here's who Jesus is, because he pictures Melchizedek. All right, so Melchizedek is a type of Christ. Now let's just look at another figure who's not a type of anything, but he's an illustration of several things, and that's Balaam. So turn back to the book of Numbers, chapter 22. This is where in chapter Numbers 22 through 24, Balaam appears several times. I'm not going to read all this, but we'll summarize it. So the children of Israel are in the wilderness. In fact, they are now on the east side of the Dead Sea, in the land that comes to be known as the land of Moab. And they are a strong people. And of course, the Moabites are a little bit worried about, a couple of million people show up in your backyard. A, they tend to take your resources, and B, they might take over. The Moabites don't know that they're just passing through. They're looking at that land across the Jordan, and they don't want them around. So the king of Moab, down in verse 4, the second part there, Balak, the son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the people of Amal, to call him, saying, Behold, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth, and they're dwelling opposite me. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. All right, first of all, again, like Melchizedek, we look at Balaam and we go, who is this guy? He knows the Lord. At some point, he's called a priest of God, or a prophet of God, and prophet of God. And how does he know the Lord? And what gives him any kind of unique power that Balak at least believes that if Balaam curses somebody, they get cursed? And by the way, by what God does to him, that seems a reasonable thing, because God does not allow him to speak a curse. You think, if his curse has no power, God would let him say anything he wants to say. No big deal. But if he speaks a curse against Israel, they'll be cursed, and God won't allow it. And that is the way the story goes. So the elders come to Balaam, and they give him Balak's message. In verse 8, he said to them, Lodge here tonight. I'll bring back word to you as the Lord speaks to me. Now look at that. How does Balaam know? Balaam says, all right, stay here. I'm going to talk to the Lord. The Lord lets me do this, I'll do it. Now, how does he know the Lord? He's about as strange a character as Melchizedek. We don't know how he knows the Lord. He's not a Hebrew, not a descendant of at least of Isaac, though he could possibly be a descendant of Ishmael. But Balaam said to God, Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, Behold, a people has come out of Egypt, etc. Verse 12, God said to Balaam, You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they're blessed. So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, Go to your own land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. So the princes of Moab rose, went to Balak, and said, Balaam refuses to come with us. So he sends them more. And he says, they tell him down in verse 16, Let nothing hinder you from coming to me, for I'll surely do you great honor. Whatever you say to me, I'll do. Come curse this people for me. Balaam answered, Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord to do less or more. So God came to Balaam at night, down to verse 20. If the men have come to call you, rise, go with them, but only do what I tell you. So Balaam rose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the princes of Moab. Now here's where you get the story of Balaam's donkey speaking to him. And Balaam's donkey has much more sense than this prophet does. And so Balaam, you know the story. He tries to curse the people because Balak gives him so much money. And he tells Balak what to do. But God just fills his mouth with blessing. He gets his first oracle. And by the way, every one of these is in a really highly stylized poetry. In chapter 23, verses 7 through 10, his second oracle in verses 18 through 24, and his third oracle in chapter 24, verses 3 through 9. And Balak gets mad at Balaam, and he said, man, I called you to curse my enemies, and you blessed them three times. This is verse now 11 of chapter 24. Therefore now flee to your own place. I'll certainly honor you, but the Lord has held you back from honor. Balaam said to Balak, did I not tell your messengers whom you sent to me? If Balak should give me his house full of silver and gold, I would not be able to go beyond the word of the Lord to do either good or bad of my own will. What the Lord speaks, that will I speak. And now, behold, I'm going to my people. Come, I'll let you know what this people will do to your people in the latter days. And then here's Balaam's final oracle, which contains a messianic prophecy. Verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Verse 19, one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities. And he blesses them again, even including this reference to the Messiah. But now look at chapter 25. So Balaam can't curse them, but he does get something done. Look at this. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal to Baal of Peor. You see, what Balaam told them, he said, I can't curse them. Nothing's going to come out of my mouth but what God says. But if you will marry your daughters to their sons, you'll beat them. You'll take over them. It's that simple. And this becomes in essence, an illustration in the New Testament of three things, this whole story. They're all found at the very end of your New Testament. Turn, first of all, to 2 Peter. In 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter is warning his readers about false teachers and prophets, and how there are always false teachers that come among the people. And he warns them that God always destroys these false teachers. And down in verse 14, he's describing false teachers. They have their eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. here, so he noticed this phrase, the way of Balaam. So what is the way of Balaam? Well, it's that he loved gain from doing wrong, that he was willing to do wrong for a price. And when he was set out to do it, that even God used a dumb donkey to speak and rebuke him. So there's the way of Balaam. Turn over now to Jude, last book before Revelation, and look at verse 10. Jude is using much the same language that Peter used, warning about these false teachers. These people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they're destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. And Luke invokes three quick images there. The way of Cain, Balaam's error, and Korah's rebellion. So what is Balaam's error? Well, it's that he could somehow get around the will of God. He at first says he can't. He tells the king that, but then he over and over he tries to curse them. And God just fills his mouth with blessing. But he makes this error that he can somehow circumvent the will of God. Turn over to Revelation chapter 2. And here in Jesus is sending this letter through John to the church in Pergamum. He says in verse 12, to the angel of the church in Pergamum write the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, yet you hold fast my name, and you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Therefore, repent. So here he uses the phrase, the teaching of Balaam. So you have the way of Balaam, the error of Balaam, and now the teaching of Balaam. And they refer to three different aspects. The way of Balaam, thinking, taking money, being concerned for gain more than for truth and right. The error of Balaam is thinking that you can circumvent the will of God. And now the teaching of Balaam is the teaching of compromise. If we can just, accept, marry their daughters and accept their gods. We can worship our God too, but we can worship their gods. There's room here, we're all trying to get to the same place. And this is the teaching of Balaam that does not hold fast to the truth. And so Balaam is not a type of Christ, obviously, not a type of Satan, but he's an illustration for us of what it means when we value money or earthly goods more than we value the truth, when we think we can circumvent the will of God and go around what God commands us, or when we think that we can make compromises with the world and that's going to turn out okay. All of that is illustrated by Balaam. So these two fascinating characters, they're similar in that both of them have some kind of relationship to God. Melchizedek, obviously, is called a high priest, and he's a true priest of righteousness and king of righteousness, king of peace. Balaam, he knows, he has some kind of relationship with the Lord. He inquires of the Lord. God speaks to him. God tells him what to say, and yet he represents error. He represents wrong thinking. He's an illustration of that. Melchizedek, a type of Christ. So in these two characters, both of them picked up in the New Testament, you see vastly different purposes of the authors. One showing us Christ, one giving us a warning. And so when you read the Old Testament, again, this is why we should know the Old Testament. Those passages in the New Testament will make no sense to you if you don't know what's going on in the Old Testament. Read it the way the apostles read it, and they're reading it and seeing their glimpses of Christ and moral instruction. Paul says it this way twice. These things are written for our examples. And so they're examples to us of how we should follow God and how we see Christ there. That this is not 66 different books. It's really one book. It's one story, and it's the story of redemption. Everything there is to point us to Christ. Even a character like Balaam, though he's not a type of Christ, shows us our need of Christ. We won't stay to the truth if we don't know Christ. On the other hand, Melchizedek, exactly a type of Christ, a picture of his priesthood forever, and points us directly to him. So this is part of the riches of the Old Testament. These guys are forgotten characters, really, but they're very, very important characters because of what's done with them in the New Testament.